Hey guys, welcome to the 183rd episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. Back again on this topic about 2024, 2026, but especially a look into the future and how I see decentralized systems and like society basically evolving past the chaos. So, I'm always hopeful. If you've watched this whole series, you'd know that I'm still very hopeful that these transitions that we're going through, we can experience them in a positive way, in a joyful way, and that's up to each individual. But so far, it's true that humanity has not done that much of a good job in terms of transitioning from one paradigm to another, one worldview to another, one political system to another. So typically when you move from monarchies of divine right to representative democracy, the change wasn't like the king said, oh, right, oh, representative democracy, what a wonderful idea. Let me just step down and let you take the reins. And the shift from monotheism to materialist science also wasn't the priest saying, oh yeah, you're right, actually all of the answers cannot be in the Bible, and yeah, there is something to this materiality and cause and effect idea, absolutely. On the contrary, if you look at Galileo's experience, so I'm hopeful. It's just there isn't much precedent for that, but hey, you can always be hopeful. So in this video, we left it at where were we? We left it at generalized shareholders and sweat equity. So this is quite important. As I've said, there's just several. Instead of having this model where you are an employee and you receive your monthly salary, oh my God, salary, once time per month, and you have a fixed salary. In the future, what I envisage is you have several layers of streams of revenue that are not paid monthly, but that are paid instantaneously. So you have your universal dividend, which you'll have on your first video, which is based on the relative theory of money. You have potentially, if you applied for a patent or something and you have some copyright, so trademark, let's put it like this, some revenue from sales or royalties. You have from royalties from art or any kind of creation, like for instance, music that somebody's streaming. You have micropayments for micro tasks. You obviously still have the employment payment, but this can now evolve to being paid every day, daily basically, and can fluctuate. Like you just have a percentage of the total sales of or the total revenue of the company and on that day, plus at the end of the month a bonus based on this month's performance. And based on this sound kind of idea that the business still has to have some cash flow, still has to have some reserves in case there's like a little dip or something. But the problem with these fixed contracts and fixed salaries is that they're very inflexible, which is why you have to fire people and then hire them again when things pick up. Whereas if you have a fluctuating revenue based on the revenue of your company, then there's no need to fire you. When business is low, your revenue is low. When business is high, your revenue is high. But then, so these are, and these are all, they just keep on falling all the time. It's like when you're breathing in and breathing out, or when you're eating. I mean, your cells are constantly feeding off of energy. They don't have to wait for the end of the day to get their oxygen as worth. So it's trying to transform the economy so that it's more organic. And generalizing being a shareholder, to me, is very important. So instead of this employment kind of contract, you could say that every single employee actually becomes a shareholder. Or you have the opportunity to be paid in shares, percentage of shares, rather than revenue. You could envisage a system, and I've written an article, maybe I'll put it in the description, whereby when you join a company, it's almost as if you have to buy a certain, shares from the company. You're kind of forced to buy those shares. And so either you have the money, or you dedicate part of your revenue to buying back those shares. And depending on whether you buy it all or whether you buy it, you receive dividends. And when you leave the company, you have to sell your shares. And you have to sell them to a new person that comes to work there. Ideally, society would basically be, in the society, everybody would be a shareholder of something. There wouldn't be this division of classes between the have and the have-nots or whatever. Everybody would be a shareholder to some degree. And that would be facilitated. And another way that you could do it is sweat equity again. And sweat equity means that instead of being paid in these micropayments or these micro tasks in money, you could be paid in a tiny little percentage of the company's future revenues. So 0.001%, for instance. And it's really up to every person to sort of decide how they want to be paid. But what's interesting there is you're kind of tethering yourself to your well-being, to the well-being of society as a whole. So when you're a shareholder, basically, the dividends you receive are basically, it's like society is whatever society is producing, whatever wealth society have, you get a portion of that, invariably. But normally shareholders imply an involvement meaning not just involvement as in today, where the involvement when you're a shareholder is you do your research and you're a very good investor, you're very good at detecting what has value and what doesn't, but involvement in terms of supporting the businesses that you believe in, supporting, having a voice in deciding how your business, the businesses operate where you live. And so, yeah, it's a whole idea of kind of democratizing, access to being shareholders for everyone. Now, the transition from one system to another could be interesting. For instance, you could have a law that decides that any company, for instance, that has above 100 employees has yearly votes. Every year, there's an anonymous vote by all employees to ask if they want to buy back their company collectively as the people working there and become the shareholders or the owners of the company. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that all privately owned shares of companies should be reclaimed by the people working for the companies. But to a certain degree, the problems that we're experiencing today is because there's a disconnect between the shareholders on the one hand and the companies on the other hand that produce the goods and services. That is, these factories, for instance. When you have shareholders that reside or live in the other side of the world and own shares of a company that's, for instance, creating a lot of pollution or plenty of environmental problems or whatever on the other side of the world, and they can live in their yachts or their villas in another country where they vote for extremely stringent environmental laws because they want to breathe clean air, but all they care about is maximizing profits, so they're ensuring that they don't really care whether the companies that they own pollute, as long as they don't pollute in their backyard right here. That's one of the problems, is that when you have shareholders that are completely disconnected from the reality or the working conditions or the societal kind of impact of what they own, then they can have this very cynical approach of just being about maximizing shareholder value, maximizing revenue, maximizing profits and dividends, and not at all paying attention to more overarching goals, like, for instance, does this policy destabilize the local societies? Does it create pollution? Does it destroy ecosystems or whatever? Whereas if the employees are the shareholders of the company, well, obviously they also have a vested interest in maximizing shareholder value, because whenever the company performs better, they get, their salary increases, their dividends increase, their revenue increases. But since they have to actually work in that factory and breathe in the toxic fumes, or basically live with the consequences of the decisions they make in terms of, if they decide that they don't care about pollution or whatever, then there is a kind of balance to be struck here that only they can come up with, of how much importance do they put on breathing clean air or working in a decent environment, and how much focus do they put on having a lot of dividends and revenue. And this arbitration can't really be done at the level of shareholders when they're disconnected from the reality of what's happening in these companies, when they're residing in a very far country and they don't really care. As long as they can squeeze out more profits. And also, shareholders, they can also do a pump and dump scheme or a very short-term investment scheme where they extract as much value from a company as they can, then dump the stock to outsiders or suckers, and then do the same with another company. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case of all shareholders. Obviously not. Some shareholders are really doing due diligence, respecting all kinds of laws, and doing this responsibly, basically. But there is a risk of that. And then obviously, this is one situation. It's very caricatural, where the 100 employees buy back their entire shares of the entire company. But what I envisage is rather a system where you would have a shared kind of ownership between employees and shareholders, where it's, for instance, 50%, 50%, where the shareholders and the employees need to agree consensually on how to run the company in order for there to be any progress or advancements. And so, it's almost like democratizing the private companies, democratizing the workspace, where suddenly, as a worker, you also have a voice, not just through protests and not showing up for work, which is kind of blackmail. It's just very childish in a way as a strategy. It's like, when you want to twist the hands of your parents as a kid, you just roll over in the dirt or start kicking your feet, and thereby, you make them late for wherever they want to go. And so it's almost like sabotage, basically. And that's sad, because normally employees should be motivated and invested in their company. Why would you work for a company that you don't believe in, that you don't like? Why would you help producing goods that you don't believe in, that you think are crap? But the thing is, if you like your job, but your shareholders and the board of directors and all these people that are cynical make it a nightmare for you to work there, that's not a good situation. And so the kind of ideal situation is a mixed kind of ownership, where you have to have a balance between external interests, internal interests. And now, so imagine if these 100 employees decide to buy back the company. Now, there are plenty of things that the shareholders could do, could block that or whatever, or they could pump up the value of the shares to make it unaffordable for these people. So you can think of plenty of systems whereby, for instance, once the employees vote, or a week before the vote or something, the value of the shares is frozen for a certain period of time until the vote, and you cannot buy or manipulate or do anything with the shares. And then if the employees decide to buy the company, then they buy it at whatever rate was frozen. That's the first thing. The second thing is you could have pools of capital, whether in this situation it could be typically public funding, but pools of capital that loan the money to employees, give them a loan, like a public loan or a state loan or something with a very advantageous interest rate, for them to be able to buy back those shares. And that could also be pension funds. It could be plenty of different things. And obviously you need to have due diligence here and making sure that the company is viable, that its turnover is good, that its overall health is good, or that the employees have a decent plan for the future, and they're not just buying it to make another buck, or are in league with the shareholders to actually pump up the stock to the highest value and then dump it or whatever, or maximizing dividend. I mean, it's all these kinds of checks off obviously have to be there, but not every employee has 100K, for instance, sitting in his savings account to be able to collectively buy back 50% of the shares of the company. And then finally, you could also have systems where you have 33%, where you'd have, this would be employees, this would be private shareholders, and this would be some kind of public body or something. Now, not necessarily government, because it wouldn't, how should I say, the centralized governments we have now, because if we're moving towards self-governance, it could be something else, but something that represents the public interest. And you have these type of companies, like for instance, imagine if you privatize the National Rail Service or the National Post Service. And there are some of these services, some of these services that if you privatize them, it can turn into chaos. I'm thinking of, for instance, privatization of the railway in Great Britain, for instance, and it's basically chaos. You have plenty of companies exploiting it, but it's just the schedules are off, the trains sometimes are canceled. I mean, it's a bit chaotic. Or imagine the postal service, where the post basically doesn't distribute nationwide, and I mean, there's just plenty of companies, some of them, which are quote unquote natural monopolies, and where obviously you have to allow for private companies to exploit something like public infrastructure, like for instance the National Railway system, but whereby running one big company that makes sure that you have an optimized sort of distribution of trains or whatever across an optimized service, and steady investments in the infrastructure, because investing in infrastructure is very costly, for instance, and you don't get a return as quickly as private investments. And also weather certain shocks. Like for instance, typically what happens is when things are profitable, companies are there. Like that's what the rail was. The railway service was back in the 19th century. Many of these railway companies were private, and then once it becomes unaffordable or not profitable, then they just dump it on the public, on states to run it at a deficit. And then when it becomes profitable again, then the companies say, "Hey, this is scandalous. This is unfair competitive advantage that you are, hogging or nationalizing this or keeping these profits to yourself. You should privatize the train system." And you can go back and forth like this. Whenever things are not profitable, you dump it. And the same for many things. The same for healthcare. The same for so there's a certain number of businesses, services, or companies or things that are very of public interest. Typically, for instance, telecommunication companies. I mean, everybody needs access to telecoms. But there's certain other companies that don't provide something that is a vital necessity or that have a public interest dimension to it. And so these kinds of companies would have also a representation in their shareholders that would come from some kind of entity that speaks on behalf of the public interest, not just the interest of the employees that are there, not just the interest of private shareholders that can live at the other side of the world and don't really care what's happening as long as dividends are paid, but also someone that looks at how those businesses are run and how they impact society. So this is just like several ideas brainstorming here, but you get the picture that from this situation, you now have a much more organic kind of society. And since these revenues for people are not coming from a single source, it allows for a lot more flexibility in terms of, getting revenue or not being scared of losing your job. Absolutely. Because if you lose one of these, the others are resilient and you can sort of get back on your feet more easily. If you lose the royalties, well, you wouldn't lose the royalties, but if, for instance, nobody listens to your music anymore, you still can have like more micropayments or get another job. But like today, the system is, if you're fired from your job here, then you get unemployment benefits, which need to be taxed out of people that are working. And so it is a kind of solidarity mechanism that is kind of forced upon society that doesn't necessarily need to be there once you transition to something like this, and removes a lot of inefficiencies. So that's for transforming the entire economy into generalizing the idea of everyone being a shareholder to some extent. Of course, not everyone is going to be a shareholder to the same extent, but generalizing that idea and making the broadening basically the base of shareholders, and ensuring especially that employees can become shareholders so that they represent more accurately the best interest of the company and of the impact it has on where they live, because they live close to that company. And so, it impacts the health of also their families, their kids, and they should have a voice in deciding what's happening there, and also get some proceeds from, the sales and so on. So now let's move on to the next point. And that's, socialization versus liberalism. Now, typically, the kind of system that we have right now is you have a state which has a monopoly of power, legitimate power, usage of power, and forces a certain socialization of and solidarity. So if you think of taxation, for instance, and the state takes taxes from businesses in order to pay for roads, for instance, or schools, think of it this way. Imagine if there are a certain number of workers here that need to extract the raw materials for the roads and build the roads and build the machines that build the roads, and a number of school teachers that work in the schools and the builders that have to build the schools. And taxation, you can think of it as, imagine here there are a lot of other workers that produce goods and services in the economy. Well, it's as if the state came and took a certain percentage of what these people produce and gave it to the teachers and the road workers. Instead of having this schools as being as having like a little entrance here where there is a fee, and the people that have children here, would go to the school and pay in order to access that school. And so instead of having society pay individually for using the roads by first having tolls every 2 miles or something, or having to each pay for kids attending high school, then the state just does it across the board, which is called socialization, which means that regardless of whether you have children or don't have children, regardless of whether you're driving a car or not, they're going to take an average amount of goods from everyone and just distribute them directly to teachers and these road workers and all that stuff. Except instead of taking the goods, they take your money or revenue, but symbolically it's the same thing. Because ultimately, if the government distributes these vouchers to these people, it's as if 30% of your production, basically, they took money from you so that these people can buy 30% or 40% of what you produce. So I'm just skipping a step here, but it's just to make it a bit more clear that money is just a symbolic representation for accessing a certain portion of the goods and services that are available in the economy. And so actually, it's almost as if the state came in and took 30% of your merchandise and then distributed it to whoever they wanted. And in exchange for that, you get quote unquote free access, which isn't really free, to things that are of public utility. And you could say that this is done efficiently or not efficiently. You can agree with the principle or disagree with the principle. There is an argument to be had that it's actually quite equivalent in terms of the risks. You could have either a very inefficient state that does this very poorly, taxes too much or too little, or runs these services in very inefficient ways, where basically because public contracting either is too complex or because it's too lax, you have companies that abuse the state and charge too much for their services, or do poor quality jobs, or since there's no competition, then there's no incentive to create better roads or improvement in the school systems. So there are all those arguments for not having socialization in the public sphere. But there's also arguments against liberalism in the sense that schools can also just, also be run very poorly in the private space. For instance, when you're paying for your education, in some cases, for instance, you expect to leave with a diploma and not be flunked. And so there is, evidence for supporting the fact that when you pay for your education, and you pay a lot for your education, then the quality of your education may not be up to par, and the diploma you have is just a piece of paper, a rubber stamp, but that you didn't actually acquire the skills because you cannot be flunked. You cannot fail because you've paid, in advance. Or the roads that, it's just chaotic to have tolls every so often, and the quality is also kind of chaotic, and there's no coordination. You can have a lack of coordination. You can have and so, it can be very poorly run, or it can be very poorly efficient in both liberalism or in kind of more socialist kind of exception. The running of things that are of public utility, let's say, or public interest, like schools, roads, hospitals, and all that stuff. And there needs to be a balance between these two. And so one thing is about efficiency. So state and taxes. Remember in the very first episode, we were talking about relative theory of money and this universal dividend that's being paid daily. Well, imagine if you get 10 euros daily. Well, instead of getting 2 euros, you could get 7 euros, and 3 euros are directly taken out of those 10 euros into a giant pool of money that is managed by the self-governing structure. And here I'll jump a little step, because we'll be talking about decentralized cities also, because it's kind of linked. It is that the best governance level, and this comes from the work of Benjamin Barber, a late political scientist, American political scientist, that argued that it would be better, instead of having the UN with nations, to have a world parliament of mayors. And why would that be better than having countries? It's because if you look at where your empathy or what you're interested in as a human stops, it typically is what happens in your city, where you live. Like an American that lives in Dallas, Texas, doesn't give a crap about what happens in Alaska. And that's just a fact of life. It's just that the human kind of care or concern, or direct concern, because 90% of the time, that's where you are. You're in your city, you're seeing the streets, you're seeing the people, you're seeing what happens there. Then your biggest concern is what happens there. And what happens at the other side of the country, they may be in a completely different situation, completely different predicament. And yet, and this is the tragedy here, you are allowed to vote and elect for people that are going to determine the destiny of people that live 1,000 miles from you, that don't have the same life, don't have the same culture, don't have the same situation, don't have anything common. And that is, quite disturbing in a way, which is why in many countries there is a kind of redistribution of, responsibilities between what is federal and what is, local. And local governments have more power, or, a certain number of flexibilities or in terms of how they organize, whether it's garbage collection, whether it's, schooling systems and all kinds of other things. And it makes sense, because while you need to have some kind of coherence at the national level, the degree to which, or the power that you should have at the national level in creating this kind of coherence, and the balance with flexibility at the local level, that needs to really be well thought of. And so the way that I envisage the world is with a network of self-governed decentralized cities that, are loosely based on countries, but that kind of transcend this very limited idea of, national boundaries and all that stuff. Countries and nation states had a role to play in the development of humanity as a global collective organism. And it's almost like the nation state was a kind of a mold or a protective barrier for different organs, just like in your body, like the stomach, the intestines, the lungs, the heart. There are different organs that need to kind of form and achieve a certain state where they are functioning more or less autonomously and are fully developed. And then once they're fully developed, then they can sort of click into place with other organs and function as one global coherent whole. But when the baby is around 5 or 6 months old, the organs are developing, but they're not yet ready to sort of, click together and work as a functioning whole. They're still in formation. And so the ties and the links between them are not yet mature enough. And there is evidence, if you look at Michael Evans' work, which I really enjoy, that organs actually are competing in the first months when they're actually developing inside the body before starting to work together and not competing with each other. And you have the same exact story at the level of humanity, where countries are competing and then gradually they harmonize their relationships and it becomes more of a symbiosis. And we've experimented with these kinds of symbiosis in many different ways, whether it's with the European Union or the United States or Switzerland or plenty of these countries which try to reconcile different communities, different national interests, different commercial interests into something that clicks. But all of these institutions are still based on representative democracy. They're not fit for transitioning to self-governance. And self-governance, to me, stops at the city. That is, I don't see, well, maybe it will happen, I don't know, but I don't see like an entire country like the United States being run via self-governance, via a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. But I do see cities being run in that way. And so you could have this pool of money that is collected based on a sort of base taxation that is automatically taken out of your universal dividend that you receive, which is like a fresh monetary creation, and goes into this pool that is spent via a DAO and citizens having to vote for the release of the funds. And it's not like the citizens would have to micromanage every single spending or whatever that's happening in the economy. It can be facilitated with AI and a certain number of tasks or jobs or services that the citizens decided to socialize. And so if you look at the way that schools run, if you decide that that's a service that you want to provide, then your only decision basically is how much funding you allocate for the schools and designing a sort of a roadmap for what you expect those services, the way that you expect them to be run. And then it can just go on like this and you don't have to revise them, every 2 years or something. And you can have citizens that, self-governance is just something that should be taken, like it's a video onto itself. Like, how do you make sure that a community like does this self-governance and makes decisions about how to run certain public services without having to elect state officials or having bureaucrats in place with a centralized government. That's a whole video onto itself. And I'm sure there's many videos out there that show how that can be done, right? One potential advancement in that direction is what's been happening with elections. Like typically, normally when you elect someone to be in the parliament, you have to go through the election process. You have to elect somebody from a party, from a political party. But now what's interesting is when you elect people by sorting, which means you just pick citizens randomly from the population and you put them together and you ask them to reflect on a certain thing. It's almost like the jury principle in trials. And from all those experiences that have been happening all over the world where, different governments have tested this, the insights that come out of groups of citizens that are chosen at random are super, super helpful, actually. Sometimes even going much further than what the politicians could come up with. And so it's this idea that there is a wisdom in the crowd, a real wisdom that you can tap into. And of course, they have to be remunerated for this work and all that stuff. But, that's just one way of exiting this very rigid structure of party politics, partisan politics, and centralized authorities, where you basically have temporary special committees of a certain number of citizens elected by sorting to reflect on a certain idea or a certain problem, and then it come up with a report. And all of this, again, facilitated by AI, which means that AI, and we'll see that in subsequent videos, can serve as a feedback mechanism between what the people think, what the different decisions that have been made, giving advice and tips to the people that are reflecting on these services to allow them to iterate and move much quicker in making decisions. And in these decentralized cities that are run like this, then they create natural links with neighboring cities with things that they have in common or of mutual interest. So for instance, if there is a river that flows between these two cities, they're going to create a special kind of group or task force to manage that. If they trade a certain number of goods and services, they're going to create a certain number of smart contracts or agree on a certain number of things to manage that relationship. And you could have AI, and we'll talk about that later, that looks at the general coherence between all of the decisions that are made at the individual city-state level, to ensure that one city doesn't decide to change, for instance, the space between the rails for their special locomotives, and this city decides to enlarge them. And so, when you want to travel by train from this city to that city, there's actually a point where you have to, jump off the train and go to another train because the train cannot move to that other city. So you have to have a certain number of coherence, even though you have this self-governed decentralized structure. And AI can be there to surveil that and offer suggestions or send messages to these two communities to say, hey, you two need to talk because you're discussing and potentially making decisions that are incompatible or that would lack coherence between yourselves. And so, we see the benefits of having a certain number of forceful standards, whether it is, the plug system. Imagine if, obviously we still have, 5, 6, 7 different types of plugs around the world, but imagine if that were 200 different types of plugs, or maybe even more, maybe 1,000, because, each energy company inside a country would even have their own proprietary plug system. It would be chaos. And you need something or some authority to create those kind of standards or issue those kinds of standards. And so this world mayor kind of idea, world mayor forum or parliament, is typically one of those bodies or planetary bodies, you could say, that would be in charge of making standardization decisions that impact the entire society. Internet, for instance, the internet is the perfect example of, thankfully, you have like I think it's the, what is it called? The World Wide Web Consortium or something, which is responsible for making sure that the IPv4, 5, 6, whatever, that basically the internet is compatible and have these standards for email, for the TCP/IP protocol, and for all these kinds of systems, so that the internet can work across the board, across the planet. And that kind of wisdom has to be ported to a world which transitions towards self-governance and away from centralized structures, still keeping the ability to create coherence and create standards across the board at a planetary level for things that are really relevant to create that kind of coherence. And so it isn't about setting standards for the number of holes in your shoelaces in shoes, but those things need to be discussed. Like what should be standardized and harmonized, how much freedom or leeway you should leave. And I think the World Mayors Parliament, coupled with AI tools that monitor coherence and decisions and the way that different decentralized communities are evolving and flagging potential issues that could hinder coherence, would be a great feedback loop for ensuring at the same time resilience, where you have each decentralized city is kind of autonomous, self-contained, and produces energy locally and has all kinds of basically, so that if one of these fails, then all of the others can prop it up or heal. And it's the same for your body, basically. Like if you have a wound or something, it isn't because one of your organ fails that everything else fails. Like it is interconnected, but there is a kind of resilience that is there because of that kind of network and complex interdependence between everything, and yet a certain resilience locally speaking. And that's what makes it its strength, that when one organ has difficulties, then the other organs, because they function well, allow for that organ to heal up to the point where all the rest is also, the rest of the body is in good shape. So yeah, taxation, for instance, is to me one of the areas which can benefit from enormous simplification. I think that today as a society, we waste so much resources on the whole taxation issue. With this system whereby you automatically take a certain percentage of your universal dividend and put it into a common pool of money, and possibly VAT on any kind of sales, because if sales happen via smart contracts on the blockchain, you can very easily set up an automatic VAT fee to be applied to the sale, or to take a percentage of that sale and put it into that pool automatically. You don't need companies to fill in forms. And with those two revenues alone, you could collect a similar amount of tax as the states are collecting now, but you can get rid of all of the taxes for corporations. Corporations would not need to pay any taxes whatsoever. Also, all your employees on their salaries would not need to pay any taxes either. You'd only have VAT, which is, every time there's a sale, there's a percentage of that sale that goes to this pool. And upon creation, a portion of that money that is created goes into that pool for things that are deemed of public interest. Imagine the efficiency gains. Like we're talking about bullshit jobs, for instance. Having all these specialized tax lawyers that optimize the fiscal, kind of architecture of these companies so that they pay the least amount of taxes. I mean, and then you have all these civil servants that are paid to hunt down for the people that are trying to avoid taxation and all that stuff. And it's crazy the amount of wasteful resources and time and energy that we waste as humanity on taxation. And it's super complex, super sophisticated. And as if you listened on the first episode for the relative theory of money, the redistribution mechanism for preventing someone to accumulate all the wealth and then becoming, setting up monopolies and stuff is baked into the way that it functions. And so you don't need to have this redistribution mechanism. You can, if you want to, from this pool, also have unemployment benefits, but it's not mandatory. So I'll leave you with this. Maybe I'll go a bit deeper and further in reflecting on the decentralized cities architecture and the interplay with AI and the world mayor's idea. but this video is already long enough, and so we'll move on to the next topic in the next video. Hope you find it interesting. Don't forget to leave a comment, share, subscribe if you liked it, and see you soon.